So, in our previous lesson, we had talked about how the revolutionaries had now begun to take action, how they had stormed the Bastille, they had forced the king and queen out of their palace, and how they had removed them from their home to go back to Paris. And they were starting to assert their power in France. Now, we're going to see how France changes from a monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. And that is when the Legislative Assembly is formed. They put together a constitution, they forced the king to abide by it, and this replaced the National Assembly that we had been discussing earlier. And so the Legislative Assembly has the power to create laws, but the king still had an executive power. So there were certain things that the king could overrule or veto, but the monarch was limited. And it really is based off of Montesquieu's ideas of a check and balance system, in which the United States also borrowed ideas from that when they created the United States Constitution. But one of the key documents that was passed here was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of Citizen. And in this document, it stated that men are born and they remain free in equal rights. And these rights were rights that included liberty, prosperity, security, resistance to oppression. And the document also guaranteed citizens equal justice, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. It sounds pretty familiar to something we would be accustomed to here in the United States. And so they argued that these rights are natural, or their men are born with these rights. They are, as Thomas Jefferson put it, unalienable rights. They're guaranteed to everybody. You can't take those away. And that was included here in this French Declaration. So as the assembly began to grow in their power, they began to take over things like the church, and they declared that the church officials and the priests were to be elected because they were under state control. And so the Catholic Church began to lose their influence and their autonomy to be able to make their own decisions, and then they began to lose their lands, and they no longer had the ability to work or to exercise their religion apart from state control. And the assembly here was primarily doing this for economic reasons, and they wanted to take over the church lands and the church buildings so that they could sell them off to those that wanted to buy this property to help pay off the French debt. And so the assembly's actions here against the church set off some huge warning signs to the people, and many were turned off and they were scared at what the government was going to do because of the fact that now the church is being attacked, and many of the French people were very devoted to the Catholic Church. And so the fact they were trying to take over the church and make the church part of the political system really offended a lot of the French people. And in some ways we could question, is some of that protected, or is that allowed or going to happen in the United States? And so we got to look at what happened there compared to what could happen in the United States. Now, this is a crash course video on the French Revolution. I'll put the link in Canvas if you would like to watch it. It's a really good summary of the entire French Revolution. I'd highly recommend that you do use that. Now, we get to the point where Louis and the Legislative Assembly just are not working well together. We talked about it in our simulation together, some of the reasons why Louis was tried for treason, why he was tried for abuse of power. So we're not going to go into all that, but he ultimately was convicted of treason. The vote was extremely close. It was one vote that made the decision. And so in January of 1793, that's a perspective date. You're not going to need to memorize that. But that is when they beheaded Louis XVI. And he said this as he walked to the guillotine for his execution: "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death. And I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." And he walked very calmly, very stoic, very little emotion as he walked there to meet his fate. And so here's an artist's rendition of the execution of King Louis, and they love to pick up the head and display it and show that they had successfully guillotined the victim here in this. And so the guillotine was still used in France up until 1977. There were a lot of things that went along with it, especially during the Reign of Terror, things like quartering of people. They were hanging people, beheading using the axe, all kinds of stuff was pretty popular. But the guillotine was the primary method of execution during the French Revolution. And here is Marie Antoinette, and she also met a similar fate as she was tried for treason and executed shortly after her husband. Now, the violence doesn't stop there with the execution of the king. In fact, it actually gets worse. And so, Austria and Prussia are neighbors of France, and they had tried to reestablish Louis on the throne. Well, the people realized this, and that's one of the reasons why they convicted him of treason. And so they went after Austria and Prussia, and Austria and Prussia declared war on France because they wanted to make sure that the France ideas did not begin to infiltrate their own countries, and their kings were threatened by that. And so there is a war declared on Austria and Prussia, and soon Britain, Holland, and Spain, they jump into this to try to defend their own liberties, their own freedoms that they had there. And so the political power that gains the most power, the most authority during this time was the Jacobin political party. Now, most of the people here in the government were members of this political party that were into all of these changes, and so they're the ones that are going to now be calling all the shots. One of the most prominent of all the Jacobin party were members Jean-Paul Marat and Maximilien Robespierre. Now, Marat, he was the one who created a newspaper meant to inform the people. It was called The Friend of the People. That's the English translation. I'm not going to give you the French one right now, but it's called The Friend of the People. In this newspaper, he tried to organize all of those that were anti-king or anti-established government and try to give them all the reasons why they should support the new, more radical Jacobin party and why they were better off than when they had a king in control of their country. So he also called for the death of all those who supported the king. And so it was pretty intimidating for those who were not part of Jean-Paul Marat's party and his ideas. Ironically, he was stabbed to death in his own bathtub, and that is the end of him. Now, Maximilien Robespierre, he kind of became the next leader of the Jacobin party, and he becomes the face of what is called the Reign of Terror because he is put in part of a group of people called the Committee of Public Safety, and their whole purpose and their whole plan was to put a bubble around those that were in support of the revolution. And anybody who was not part of that bubble was going to be executed, they were going to be arrested, they were going to be persecuted, basically intimidated out of the country so that they only had supporters remaining. So Robespierre tried to build a republic of virtue by trying to get rid of all of the past, anything that reflected France's past and all the corruption, the unfairness, the bitterness that people had toward the previous government. They even went as far as to create a brand new calendar because one of the things of France's past was the influence of Catholic religion. Well, they had done a really good job of eliminating as much of the French religion as possible. Well, the calendar was one of those things that traced itself back to religious heritage, and so they decided we're going to create a brand new calendar, and this calendar had no Sundays in it because the radicals considered religion to be old-fashioned, to be dangerous to their ideals, and so in this new calendar, it was, I think they had 6 days, and they renamed all the months, and it was just a whole strange, weird thing here. They even went as far as to close all the churches in Paris, believing that any of the churches that were still around were going to be influential in the government. They didn't want that, so they closed them there, and in time, surrounding towns and eventually most places around France did the same thing. Now, during this time of the Reign of Terror, there were some mass accusations or somewhat sketchy accusations against people who were not part of this revolution. Now, there were a lot of people who did not support the revolution, and they wanted to have a more stable, secure government. But I mentioned the Committee of Public Safety earlier, and their primary goal was to protect the revolution from any enemies. And so Robespierre, under his leadership, went out and tried to find any enemies of the revolution and tried them early in the morning, and they had them guillotined in the afternoon. And so Robespierre justified this reign of terror, or this method, by suggesting that it helped French citizens to remain true to their ideals of revolution. He also saw a connection here between the ideas of virtue and terror. And so there were about 40,000 who were executed during this reign of terror, most of which were peasants and members of the poor or middle class. Ironically, those are the ones that the revolution had begun to help benefit. And yet 85% of those that were executed during this time were those who were part of that class. Now here's what Robespierre said about virtue and terror. He said, "The first maxim of our politics ought to be to lead the people by means of reason, and the enemies of the people by terror. If the basis of popular government in a time of peace is virtue, the basis of popular government in a time of revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is murderous. Terror without which virtue is powerless. So terror is nothing else than swift, severe, indomitable justice. It flows then from virtue." And so they clearly saw a correlation between those two ideas in his philosophy. Now, the National Convention eventually turned on Robespierre, and he was tried and executed for not supporting the revolution, for betrayal, and he went to the guillotine himself. And there were a lot of people who began to fear their own lives, and they were kind of tired of the reign of terror. They were tired of all the bloodshed, and they were most tired of the high inflation of prices of bread and salt and the basic necessities of life. And so they wanted stability. They wanted somebody who was going to come and say, here, we're going to move on beyond this reign of terror. We're going to stop the revolution. We're going to just get back to the way things were. So in I think it's supposed to be 1799. I guess it's maybe 1789. I may have my dates mixed up on here. It put the power in the hands of the middle class. And they established this new government here to where they are going to support the upper middle class and put together a two-house legislature. And this is part of the Legislative Assembly I mentioned earlier. I think my timeline was off, and that's why I may have gotten that confused here. But it's that new Legislative Assembly. And so this was a group of people that then appointed Napoleon to be the commander of their armies. Now, Napoleon had gained some popularity earlier in the Revolution, where he had stood up to help the National Assembly to protect them, and everybody remembered him. And so Napoleon was appointed as that commander of the French army. I did mention this in class about 3 different viewpoints of the revolution. This comes directly out of your book. I'd encourage you to read through this and try to distinguish why each of these would have had a different viewpoint on that revolution, especially when you look at Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine's a supporter of revolution. Notice he also is over in America, where they have just finished the American Revolution, and he sees it in a much different viewpoint than Edmund Burke, who is a British individual who is right next to France, and then he sees it as a much bigger threat right there in the edge of Europe. So a couple of key critical questions here for you to evaluate and to think about. Does the Reign of Terror here reflect what the French Revolution was all about? And then analyze here the financial crisis in France that led to revolution. Was it the financial crisis that actually led to the revolution? And then provide some evidence here to support your analysis. So it's at this point here that we begin to talk about Napoleon. I think I'm going to come back to that in another lesson. So I'm going to pause the video here.